Well, a very good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening to all of you. Joining us, this is Filippo Veglio from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for this HLPF special event with a particular angle around Chief Sustainability Officers and their perspectives on the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Delighted to be co-hosting this session alongside our colleagues of UN DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs in the UN. A warm welcome on behalf of both institutions, and of course a virtual meeting taking place in particular circumstances this year, but still with a strong HLPF platform this year under the theme of accelerating action and transformative pathways to realize the decade of action and the delivery of sustainable development. So very much continuing in special circumstances, as we all know, around health and public health and well-being overall, and delighted to be able to at least virtually be able to convey, to bring together and to assemble insights and the business voice into this crucial agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. I have the pleasure of being your host over the next 90 minutes. The session, as you know, is scheduled for 90 minutes, and the pleasure of representing the World Business Council for Sustainable Development team. Several of my colleagues are on the line, as well as several colleagues of UN DESA, of course, who are making this event possible. Allow me just a few housekeeping items, as we often call them, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them by now, of several weeks, if not months, of these kind of sessions. We want you to be aware that the session is being recorded. We would kindly ask you to be aware also that you are muted for the safety and for the overall, let's say, flow of the session. We will be sharing a short summary alongside the recording and the slides of the session in the next 24 to 48 hours of this week. So look out for it, and we'll be happy to share that information. And if I may, on a very organizational issue, if you could kindly change your Zoom display to your full name, that would be very helpful in terms of knowing who is on the line and in terms of being able to possibly interact. And in fact, interact, the main channel for interaction over and beyond the speakers, of course, who will be visible as they come along throughout the session, is the chat function. If I could kindly ask everybody to be considerate of using that chat function. You can find it on the main control tab, and type in your questions. And of course, any question and comment is welcome, and we look forward to hopefully building in also interactivity into the 90 minutes that are coming. The 90 minutes that are coming ahead are very much focused on the 5, let's say, agenda elements here around Chief Sustainability Officers for the SDGs. I will provide a few introductory remarks sort of with an institutional perspective from the World Business Council side. We'll have 2 members of the UN family providing their perspectives 6 months into this decade of action, and certainly an eventful 6 months for all the kinds of wrong reasons. We'll then have a panel of representatives or senior representatives looking at this header of building back better in terms of navigating the risks and the opportunities for business. We'll then have a video address from Japan focusing on COVID-19 and labeling it as the last chance for transformative change. And then I'll be back with a few wrap-up issues and basically closing remarks. So this is basically the program for the 90 minutes ahead, and we're delighted to see many of you on the line and people still continuing to join. Thank you so much for that. So the first part of the agenda, allow me just a few minutes of introduction with regard to World Business Council and the perspectives around business leadership in this particular era with regard to the SDGs and how the COVID-19 pandemic comes into play in that particular regard. WBCSD, Geneva headquartered organization, regrouping, associating 200 global companies from all over the world. If you take headquarters, we're looking at 40 countries in terms of headquarter location, and industry sectors over 20, and united by a common belief that business is good for sustainable development and sustainable development is good for business. So really trying to link and attempting and working towards linking business success to the sustainability imperatives that we all aware of. So the idea of business leadership and the idea of a strong and ambitious vision, as you can see it outlined here, over 9 billion people living well and within planetary boundaries by the middle of the century is what guides us. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals also very much at the core of the World Business Council's work program, which are regrouped around 6 programs that are in basically system transformations. Our ambition, we use this slide with Secretary General Antonio Guterres to outline that the ambition of WBCSD is very much to set the business agenda for the decade ahead of us, this decade of action, as Secretary General Guterres has been repeatedly underlining the essence and the importance of action, lining up with a vision and lining up, among other things, with business leadership, of course, government leadership and institutional leadership across the world, but in particular, of course, also business leadership, and really looking at this transition to the economy of the future, capturing the opportunities, but also safeguarding against some of the dangers of the developments that we have in the economy and, let's say, overall across the world nowadays. Very much transitioning from there, of course, into the reality that the decade of action has kicked off under great auspices most notably at the World Economic Forum in Davos, with a lot of drive and impetus towards really kicking off significant action, including at policymaking level on the climate and on the nature agenda. But of course, COVID-19 has significantly disrupted and called into question and crystallized a lot of the issues that we all care about around the sustainable development agenda. So certainly an excellent moment taking stock at the middle of the year now, in the middle of July, around where are we coming from over the first few months of this pandemic and where are we heading? How is the sustainability agenda impacted? How is the SDGs agenda impacted overall? And how do we position this in a proactive way to continue action and to continue collaborative efforts in that regard? We see from our side in the World Business Council a number of what we call here changes that are both disruptive and lasting, what basically to what used to be called, as we put it here, the normal situation. The normal situation, if you think of course, the upheavals around overall health and well-being of people, the tragedy of so many deaths, the tragedy of so many livelihoods affected, the tragedy of so many futures affected is something that is, of course, weighing heavily. We see also issues coming into play around possibly an increased awareness about the fragility of human life and also the fragility of life overall on the planet, the fragility of our economic systems and the supply chain. Certainly this famous mantra of just-in-time deliveries that have been optimized throughout globalization over the last 20 or more years, coming into question, also probably into a just-in-case mindset around building more resilient systems, more resilient health systems, but also more resilient supply chains. And linked to that also the idea that, of course, the pathway to the future is, as always, one might add, linked with uncertainty. Certainly, there are obstacles on the path to the future. There are readjustments to make in light of these strong realities, these tragic realities overall for the population all across the world. And so certainly disruptive and lasting changes is what we see. We have attempted in early May, so a couple of months ago, to articulate how do we see from a business side the consequences of COVID-19 for the decade ahead. How can we articulate a short piece around it in terms of how do these, how do some of the trends around demography, around politics and policy and social issues, how do they interact, how are they affected by COVID-19, and how also some existing trends, think for example of digitalization, as we see nowadays, meetings taking place online, a lot of work interaction for those privileged enough to be able to do it, taking place online, but also of course decisions about supply chains, decisions about the role of technology in society and the application of technology for interactions among society and between governments and the people under their jurisdiction. So certainly interesting trends and interesting vulnerabilities being exposed through this COVID-19 pandemic that we have analyzed, and everybody's more than welcome to visit this short report, which is available in several languages on our website. From an SDGs perspective, we see really the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs agenda with its vulnerabilities exposed by our colleagues of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who I believe it was last week issued their yearly analysis of the state of the SDGs agenda. Excellent report, always put together by SDSN. And as you can see here, the expectations around at least 13 of the SDGs with significant, well, as we call it here, high levels of negative impacts expected, if not at least moderate levels of negative impact expected. So certainly something to be aware of, also as we frame the HLPF discussion today and the wider discussions that are taking place throughout these days online in the HLPF online platform. At the core of it, from the World Business Council side, the idea, the belief, and the message that the SDGs need business. It will be impossible to deliver the SDGs without business, but at the same time, business needs the SDGs as well, needs these in this particular context now as a North Star also for recovery and response. And you can see here the sort of the angles that we outlined, the usual angles around employment, innovation, technology, but also a side of responsibility and a side of finance as an enabling factor for sustainable development. So that message continues to be underlined, if not strengthened, by this pandemic. The four key implications that we see for business from the SDGs agenda lie around these four elements here, these four bubbles in blue that we have outlined. The cost of inaction is certainly higher than the cost of action, in particular cost of collaborative action across the business community, but also in partnership with other actors across the world. The opportunity side, ultimately the Sustainable Development Goals point to needs, to given ambitions, to given aspirations of various strata of the populations, and how can they be fulfilled through more sustainable solutions. So certainly the opportunity side also there to emphasize. Then you have the governance and transparency side on the side of disclosure of information with regard to performance, disclosure with regard to alignment of science-based targets, and alignment, of course, also with policy frameworks. And last but not least, the idea that this agenda is way too complex and complicated for one actor alone to take it on itself, let alone for any business to take it on itself. So how do you drive collaboration within your company, among the peers within your sector, across industries, but also collaboration between the public and the private sector, of course, at the heart of it. From our side, we see the importance and the increasing expectation of supporting companies in making the SDGs what we call actionable. So how do you translate this overarching excellent framework and North Star of 17 goals and 169 targets and 220 indicators? How do you translate it into an actionable agenda? And you can see here how we outline it. You can work at the individual level. We have some tools that we have developed in that particular regard. You can look at prioritization at the corporate level. How do you go about it, really land it tangibly, including through that principal prioritization that I know we will be coming back on later on, but also looking at it at the sector level. How do you collaborate with leading peers within your sector to really drive a collective agenda set around ambition, but also set around regular updates on actions taken by key players in the sector. And lastly, how do you really look beyond traditional sort of topical partnerships to really build more systemic partnerships to make the SDGs actionable also at a systemic level? And we can see some interesting agendas developing around, in particular, plastics, but also food and land use. Certainly interesting work emerging around not only collectivizing ambition, but really collectivizing knowledge, insights, and commitments to translate targets into particular action across the business sector in collaboration, of course, with the public sector and its various entities. So these were a little bit of just sort of setting the scene from our side, from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And we thought it could be an interesting moment, also, of course, in the setting the scene moment, to also call upon two members of the UN family, if I can call it like that. I think I did so in the very beginning, to share with us some perspectives about, almost 7 now months into this decade of action, very early days, but also, of course, very worrying days with regard to some trend lines given the impact of COVID-19. How do we keep the SDGs at the core of the recovery and the various mechanisms in place to really address the social and various other inequities brought forward by this crisis, let alone the terrible health impacts, the tragic health impacts. So for that, we've got two excellent speakers. I want to welcome them both. If I could kindly ask them to put their camera on, then we can all see them. But we have the pleasure of welcoming Elliot Carlton Harris, who is Assistant Secretary General at UNDESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and he's Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development and Chief Economist. Very warm welcome to you, and very warm welcome, of course, to the new CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, Sanda Ojiambo. A very warm welcome to you in your new position and as a new member of the UN family, and very much looking forward to both of your perspectives. So I wanted to start off with Elliot, if I may, to provide us with some initial perspectives from DESA's side and share with us some thoughts over the line. I hand over the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Good morning, particularly to Sanda. Welcome to the UN family. Very, very good to meet you virtually, at least. You're quite right, Filippo. In the way that you presented the COVID, it is a huge and unprecedented shock to the system, to all of our systems. And it's unprecedented in the sense that we've never before had a situation where a crisis in one area, public health, has led to the absolute cessation, if you will, of economic activity and around the world, and all at the same time. We've never had a crisis of this magnitude and this simultaneity. Just a couple of figures just to show that the magnitude of what we're dealing with. We expect GDP to contract by up to 5% globally in 2020, and that is a conservative estimate. It could turn out to be considerably worse than that. And we will see that translated into deterioration in virtually all of our other indicators of progress. We're going to see poverty increase dramatically. We can find as many as 60 million people being pushed back into extreme poverty by the end of the year. Food insecurity now is a problem for 265 million more people, and quite a few children, as many as 10 million children are likely to face severe malnutrition going forward. Unemployment is a massive problem. The ILO estimates that we lose the equivalent of 400 million jobs in the course of this year. We have over 1 billion children and youth being affected, being out of school or unable to participate fully in their education and losing considerable amount of time. And we know that this is a problem that is affecting all of us at the same time, but critically, it is not affecting us all the same way. We're not being equally affected. And just to give a couple of aspects of this inequality of the impact, water and sanitation. One of the most important things that we can do to protect ourselves health-wise is to keep our hands clean, to wash them regularly. And yet 40% of the world's population doesn't have access to water and sanitation. And by the same token, we can, through our social distancing, reduce the exposure to the infections, and many of us have been able to do that by working from home, using technology, digital technology to work online, and yet half of the world does not have access to the internet, and for them this opportunity doesn't exist. And we have informal sector workers, for example, who lose every vestige of their livelihoods through the shutdown that has been happening around the world. So we have a tremendously different situation, one that hugely complicates what is already an agenda where we're off track. The reason the Secretary General had to call this launch of the Decade of Action was that even prior to COVID, we were not on track to meet the SDGs. We'd been making progress yet, but it hadn't been enough, and it wasn't fast enough. And so now we have to take the opportunity that's offered to us by this COVID crisis to think about how we want to shape our world, shape our future going forward. And all around the world, governments are thinking about how we plan and execute the recovery. And we have the opportunity here to build back better. Yeah. And so this is something that we really have to take very, very seriously indeed. And I'd like to point to three areas where we need to pay a lot of attention. For one, the crisis has shown that we need much greater resilience. Personal, individual resilience, societal and economic resilience, planetary resilience. We need to make sure that we have some of the things that we've had to put in as emergency responses, access to quality services, healthcare and education, water and sanitation, even clean energy, information communications technologies. All of these are things that we've relied on more and more in the crisis response, and they have to be part of the fabric of our future going forward. But above all, we have to strengthen social protection, individual resilience, safeguard people's livelihoods. These are the things that will allow us to deal with future shocks in a more controlled manner. We have to build back better in the sense of putting the world on a healthier trajectory. We have to use the new forms of productivity that are available to us, greener production, more sustainable consumption and production patterns, green jobs, more flexible working arrangements, things that allow us to reduce our environmental footprint as we go about our daily lives. And the last thing that I want to stress is the need for solidarity and unity. We've seen that it doesn't affect us all equally, this crisis, and shocks don't. And we need to be ready and willing to work in concert, in collaboration with each other, in cooperation with each other at a global scale, to make sure that we're all of us recovering from the crisis, we're all of us made more resilient, and that we're all of us better equipped to reach a sustainable future. And this is a whole of society approach, it's a whole of government approach, but it's also a whole of the world approach, I think, and that's critically important for us going forward. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you, Elliot. Great introduction and certainly welcome words around, the inequality of the impact, but also the word solidarity. I think is something that, it's one of the key words, solidarity among those that can afford to be solidarity and with those that are suffering. And certainly a lot of political debates, a lot of policy debates also are framing a lot of around that word. So thank you for those initial thoughts. I'm sure they resonate very well with Sanda Ojiambo as well. I hope you're on the line. I think you're on the line. If I could kindly ask you, great. If I could kindly ask you to turn the camera on, and I have leave, of course, the floor to you as incoming CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Go ahead, please, Sanda.
Okay. Philippa, just confirming, I believe my camera is on.
I cannot see you, but that might be because you're further down in my.
Yes, it's working.
It's working. Thank you, Uta. Perfect. We can see you, Sanda. I can see you now.
Great. Thank you, Philippa. And Elliot, so great to meet you, albeit virtually. Greetings from Nairobi, Kenya, where I am, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. I think I'll pick up from where Elliot started, because he's really succinctly laid out what the socioeconomic challenges are and really highlighted both the interconnectedness of the crisis as well as the inequalities that continue to be perpetuated by the crisis. Where I sit, and certainly on the continent here in Africa, there's been a real tough choice to be made about saving lives or saving livelihoods. And I think this has played out in many countries across the world. And certainly I think business has gained heightened importance and heightened visibility around the COVID response. So I'll just kind of put my comments around in the business context. What's the impact on business then? I think certainly the slowdown in economic growth has definitely impacted government spend, it's impacted consumer spend. That's undoubted. And I think the decline in GDP speaks to that. On the other hand, though, across the world, millions of small and medium enterprises have shut down, putting millions of people into unemployment. And as we know, unemployment fuels a whole list of further inequalities, and those really cannot be ignored. Unemployment, idleness, racism, xenophobia, discrimination, all those are a whole lot of social injustices that follow thereafter. When the Decade of Action was announced, we at the Global Compact really took stock of what we could do for business and what the specific call to action would be. And we recognized that perhaps business hadn't done enough in terms of engaging on the SDGs. And we had worked on a program called the SDG Ambition, which was really aimed to provide very targeted pathways to accelerate progress towards the SDGs. And that's where we were in January, and then COVID struck. Now, Filippo, in your comments, I think you mentioned at the beginning that the SDGs need business and business need the SDGs. And I think that's been a fundamental call to action for us at the Global Compact. We see three key areas where I think in terms of building back better, that business should truly engage in depth. I think the first is really around addressing social and economic inequalities. What we've seen in this COVID and post-COVID period is that, businesses that have been able to bounce back, innovate, pivot, address inequalities, have proven to be on the pathway to recovery. And I think that is a model that we do need to replicate and scale up. The second really is a clear call around how we look at financing for the future. What do the economic stimulus packages that are being deployed around the world really mean for building back inclusive business systems? I think that's a critical area of interrogation. And the third, I think, is really the opportunity to look at what is always a looming crisis for us, which is the climate crisis. As we build back, we have the opportunity to build back economies that are based on greener energy, sustainable models of resource use, and really business models that will push us further into the future in terms of addressing the sustainable development goals. When COVID started, we also issued a call to business around the 10 principles of the Global Compact. We said, look, business, this is not the time to ignore human rights, to ignore labor rights, or to not think about anti-corruption measures. And a number of our local networks around the world demonstrated that through sustained dialogue and action, they were able to move businesses to a more sustainable way of doing business, even during the COVID-19 era. So, for us, I think this has been a moment of opportunity to really reset and reflect about the decade of action, but also really see how the 10 principles can underpin building back better. And I'll stop there for now.
My rookie mistake. I think we lost you just on the last 10 seconds. Maybe you want to repeat the last 10 seconds of your sort of key statement there at the end.
Oh, I just said that I think the 10 principles for us really underscore the opportunity for businesses to build back better, because businesses that take into consideration human rights, labor rights, the environment, and anti-corruption, framed with the SDGs, are certainly on a pathway for growth and recovery.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Definitely also resonates with the World Business Council in terms of the approach, and we've done a lot of messaging also together with you, your institution, around the importance of human rights and the addressing and mitigating negative impacts, not only looking at the SDGs through the innovation and opportunity lens, but also very much through the responsibility lens, integrating the human rights agenda into it. Sandra and Elliot, if I may call you just by your first name, I know there's usually a lot of formality, but we're online. We are on quite a tight schedule, so I'm afraid I sort of need to move on already to the panel as we move throughout. We try to keep these sessions short as possible, but I think there's been a lot of very useful framing from your side within the UN family around how to really keep the SDGs at the core of the response efforts, how to build strong foundations and continue to build them, but also I think a great sense of urgency, even more urgency now, calling into question the achievement of the SDGs. I recall a statistic of last year. It was calling about 2070 would be the business as usual scenario for achieving the SDGs on the current trend lines. And I know that within UNDESA and within the Global Compact, there's a lot of effort to really bring that statistic down to something much more achievable and much more ambitious. So thank you so much for both of your perspectives, for your time. I know you've got very busy schedules and hopping around various online events. And we look forward to debriefing you, of course, on the key elements of the discussion as it emerges now through our panelists over the next 45 minutes. So thank you again, and we will be in touch again. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Allow me then, on the back of our two excellent introductory speeches and remarks, to move on to the third part of our agenda, which is headed here, Building Back Better, Navigating Business Risks and Opportunities. And for that, I have the pleasure of handing over to my colleague at ERM, Lyndon Edgell, who is going to be moderating an excellent lineup of panelists with a lot of insights from all across the world on a wide range of topics. So Lyndon and the panelists, I would kindly like to ask you to put yourself, the camera on, and we look forward to your discussion. I'm handing over to you, Lyndon, right away.
Great. Thank you, Filippo. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are around the world. It's really hard to believe that 12 months ago, many of us were in a room in New York at this same event, and how much the world has truly changed in that time. So here we are today in a virtual world, thinking about what will it take to build back better. And in fact, I kind of wonder about this phrase that we're seeing a lot, because in many ways we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back to where we were, because as our UN colleagues just told us, we were already not on track pre-COVID. So we don't want to go back to that. So maybe actually we've started to use the language of building forward better, building forward to a different place, and business being absolutely part of building forward with that future. So today we have three colleagues, effectively chief sustainability officers from three global companies who are in different sectors, and they're going to share with us how they are navigating business risks and opportunities. We also have a representative, Martina, from the government of Argentina, to provide the perspective of government working with business, and our colleague Carolyn from Shift to give a civil society perspective, a perspective about the role of people and the focus we need to have on people as we think about building back better. So as we think about our first question, I think that we can say, although we're in the middle of, I think, the pandemic now, and the numbers are still going completely in the wrong direction in so many parts of the world, but I think we've seen that our current economic model is ill-prepared to have dealt with the economic and social shock that has come out of this original sort of health shock. As we think about not only managing where we are in the middle of the crisis, but coming out of it and thinking about the aftermath, business is going to need to rethink so many dimensions around supply chains, around investment, around finance, and to think about that balance between efficiency and resilience. So for our company panelists, I ask you to think about, in this sort of economic downturn, which we think and know will be a global downturn, what are you seeing as the major challenges for those sustainability leaders within companies? And what are you planning to do to address these challenges? Kun Nopadol, I might start with you as the Chief Sustainability Officer of CP Group, a large conglomerate in Thailand. In fact, I think you're the largest private company in Thailand. You're a chief financial officer by training. How do you bring that perspective to the world of sustainability and the challenges we have today?
Thank you, Lyndon, and many thanks to WBCSD for inviting us to join. For those of you who don't know CP, we are based in Thailand, operating in 21 countries around the world. We are in 8 industries, but the main ones are food, agriculture, retail, telecoms, and we are this year 99 years old. As you are aware, when this pandemic happened in Wuhan, China, Thailand was number 2. Actually, we on the chart, we are just right behind China due to our reliance on tourism industries. So it was very frightened to all, especially Thai people, how we can combat something like unseen and this COVID-19. So let me, because of the time, very short time being given to me, let me just focus on the 3 things, 3 challenges we have to face, and we try to address them as the public, in all countries we are operating in, counting on us. The first one is job security. Second challenge would be food security. And the last one is health and well-being. And I'm so very happy to hear that Filippo named these 3, out of 5 high levels of negative impacts due to COVID-19. Let me start from job security. Currently, we employ 350,000 people in 21 countries. So the first thing our CEO came out to announce immediately that he secured all the job. There will be no layoff. So everybody is rest assured, being paid in full, no setback, because we know that we are an important part of the economy. We have to ensure our employees and executives that they can, consume and keep the economy running, and their families as well. Not only that, we went ahead and announced that we will employ another 20,000 people into our delivery departments, because we know that learning from Wuhan, things will change, the consumer behavior will change. We need to deliver all the goods to home and some offices if they were open. So we, in addition to that, we hired another 2,000 IT experts to help us, putting everything on the e-commerce platform. And this actually helped transforming our business a great deal. And at the same time, it addressed the new change of consumer behavior. So meanwhile, we keep our operation running, and our employees secure with their families at home. Second, like in all countries, there was a panic in buying basic goods, especially food. I'm talking about food security. And because our origin was from agro-business, we provide food, the food chain. So we feel that it was fully our responsible to make sure we fill all the shelves all the time. So we actually increase production to the maximum, and also preserve, the goods in the 21 countries we are in, not to export, only provide to the countries we are in. And we were able to stabilize food, and also keep our shelves full everywhere. Soon people would realize that whatever they're stocking up, it doesn't mean anything. So they stop. We just have to stop that panic. So things went back to normal, and we were very happy that we were an important part of stopping that potential disaster. We went on to that route by producing even cheaper line of food, but with the same quality, the same safety, with a lot more automations. And last challenge I want to mention to you is health and well-being. Since we have 350,000 people employed in 21 countries, we have to look after them. We secure them with health care, fully paid for if they got COVID-19. And just for your information, in Wuhan alone, we have 9,000 employees working in farms and food process. In that ground zero, 13 employees of ours were contracted by COVID-19 since the start, and they're fully recovered very soon, and none of them we don't have any fatality at all. Okay. Unfortunately, in Thailand, we have to, due to the health problem and but because of COVID-19, they passed away, unfortunately. So not only that, we went all the way to secure their families. If their family is out of work, we send food to them, to every home of our employees. By the way, we send our food to doctors and nurses, to, in all hospitals that receive patients, COVID-19 patients. And last, I want to mention that since the start, we saw that surgical masks was the key to stop the growth of COVID-19. Our senior chairman announced that we will build a factory. And by the way, we have no knowledge of building such factory, but we had to finish it in 5 weeks. And that's how we could explore our potential in in supply chain. Actually, I buy all the parts. I was the project manager of building that face mask with a capacity of 3 million masks per month. We had to buy sourcing, raw materials, machines from 3 continents and flew them in because logistic failed, due to all this standstill of every country. So we had to figure out a way. And I would like to stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, there's some quite extraordinary stories there, from being 9,000 employees that you needed to keep safe in Wuhan at the very start, through to just building a factory for 3 million masks a month. That's quite extraordinary. But also we heard about how that's fundamentally changed your business, and you've needed to adapt and become resilient in such a diverse range of parts of the economy that you work in. I might turn now to you, Alexandra, as with the link across to the food sector, similar to CP. Obviously, Syngenta work around the world and provide essential services to the agriculture sector. So can you share with us a little bit about your good growth plan and how you're responding to the challenges that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lyndon. And I really want to take the audience into the world of farmers. And I've seen a question coming in on the chat box on how are farmers really impacted. And we are seeing massive impacts to farmers, large-scale farmers, but also small-scale farmers. And especially small-scale farmers, they've been brutally cut off from their off-take markets, supply chain disruptions. And for them, a missing income for a couple of weeks because of lockdown, or now even a couple of months, this is really life-changing because they don't have large financial buffers to deal with that. So they're taking the children off schools when the schools are closed, but they might not even send them back because they will need kind of the children to work on farms, back to subsistence farming rather than getting education. So there will be generational impacts, what we are seeing. Or when you think of how much value to the rural communities tourism has provided, and tourism industry is certainly down. Tourism was financing, protecting the wildlife under SDG 15, and all of this rural value creation is now cut off. So what do these people do? Do they go back to subsistence farming? Where will they get their land from? Will they clear the lands, which has been conserved for wildlife? So these are dramatic effects we are seeing in the farming community, and farmers are our customers. Syngenta is an agricultural company. We focus on sustainability and innovation, and we work in 100 countries, and we are seeing these sort of dramatic effects actually everywhere. So our Build Back Better plan, our good growth plan, is actually focusing on 3 things. It's around partnering, it's about investing, and it's about innovation for farmers. And very concretely, when I look at partnering, we've been able to partner with great organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Solidaridad, the Fair Labor Association, now very freshly FAO, which is Hand-to-Hand Initiative, and UNCCD. And these partners help us to really drive our investments into where it is critically needed. And I do really think for the businesses who are still able to invest despite an economic crisis, really double down on investment. And we've said we commit $2 billion to innovate in sustainable agriculture. It's the right moment for that sort of investment initiative. And I really think it's an accountability for business. And when you look at innovations for farmers, what are we kind of guided by our partners to do is definitely help to agriculture and farmers deal with climate change. There is something about agriculture's own footprint where we think we can help reduce that, but definitely there is an adoption strategy when you think of food supplies, when you think of innovation to drought-tolerant crops or seeds for degraded soils, which is a regenerative approach to agriculture. We need to look at how can we achieve higher yields with less land, because we need land for wildlife. How can we achieve higher yields with fewer inputs, less water, less fertilizers, integrated pest management? And there's a whole lot of innovation coming through in the digital field. And certainly in COVID, the question and the issue of fair labor conditions for farmers, especially on child labor, is massively back on our agenda. So I do think, despite a really, really difficult environment for farmers, there are opportunities in that crisis for farmers, for the environment, but also for business, when business is focusing what it can do well. And this is investment for customers, investment for farmers, and innovation.
Thanks, Alexandra. And I think that message about investments, and now is not the time, I guess, to stop and to be risk averse. It's actually time to take that opportunity and for business to take the lead in that area. Alan, turning to you, as part of ArcelorMittal and the largest steel maker in the world, you're in industry undergoing enormous transition, and again, part of that solution. Can you share a little bit about your response to the challenges?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So obviously our first focus has been looking after our people, and we would all say that because it's true. Then the second one is just the sheer impact of this crisis on the steel industry. Sales are down, dramatically. Some plants, it's been hard to run because we haven't been able to get the people to them. But our major impact has been sales. And so now I work for a business which is, how do we get through what is essentially a sales crisis and rebuild our business? So for me, the challenge has been, how do we make sure that the sustainability issues, particularly the transition to zero carbon steel making, remains as relevant as it was before? The good news is, as part of our, of our sort of strategy to get out of the loss of sales, not a single environmental project or carbon project has been axed. And so the message that we've got to carry on doing that transition to zero carbon has certainly survived. And of course, with our European business, with all this recovery funding being linked to the Green Deal, being linked to transition, who knows, there might even be new sources of funding which might not have been available before the crisis to help us make that transition. So for me, the challenge is being very tactful in how we present our sustainability narrative. At one level, at face value, the sustainable development narrative has never been more relevant. But if you're running a very capital intensive business which has had a major sales impact, it might feel very irrelevant if you're the one who's in charge of keeping the business going. And so there's a lot of tact here in how do you just reassure the business that these environmental and social investments we were making before are as valid and as important, if not more important, now than they were before, when there's so many challenges. And I'm pleased to say that what could have been really difficult for me is actually proving to be, straightforward. The business isn't going to compromise its environmental and carbon transitions. So for me, a lot of the challenges we had in how do you actually create such a transition, re-engineer the whole business to make steel in a different way, they existed before, they still exist, and the business is just as focused on it. And the business has observed the narrative we've already articulated on this event, which is there's absolutely no chance whatsoever that the need for sustainable development, be it carbon or all the SDGs, is going to wane as a result of COVID. Indeed, quite the opposite, that the need for those SDGs to be delivered is more relevant than ever before. And I'm lucky to be working for a business whose leadership see that. So I see a lot of change in our agenda in the short term, long term, as a result of COVID. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alan. And again, I think that point around leadership is absolutely critical. And you talked about the role of the Green Deal in Europe and how that relationship between political leadership and investment and business is going to be really key. So let's turn now to our colleagues who aren't directly in the sort of business sector or working with the business sector. And I guess one of the things that we've learned out of this pandemic is that the other emergencies have not stopped. And I think our colleagues again from the UN said climate change has not changed or stopped or in any way changed in terms of the pandemic. And as we think about resilience, I guess one of the things we've learned through the pandemic is that everything is interconnected and interdependent, and that we're going to need to regenerate our economies, our communities, and the natural environment. So where do we see our biggest opportunities for business to contribute to systemic efforts to foster resilience and regeneration? And what will this mean for business models? Martina, I might start with you from your perspective from the government of Argentina, which of course is, faced with its fair share of challenges at the moment within Latin America. I think we still have you on mute, Martina.
Martina?
Sorry,
there you go.
my connection decided to stop right in that moment because it always happens.
It does, it does.
Okay, sorry. So, yes, I did hear your question. So thank you, and thank you to our hosts for inviting me to share our commitment to the 2030 agenda and to the engagement of the private sector in its implementation. Now, sorry. The 2030 agenda adoption gave us all an opportunity to embark on a new path. However, like it's been mentioned before here today, the pandemic evidenced persisting inequalities and a widespread lack of preparedness, showing deficiencies on multiple levels. Now, Argentina does not escape the circumstances, and while a set of measures have been implemented to guarantee the well-being of citizens, in the Latin American region, as you all know, we're still in the midst of a horrific battle with COVID-19. The global health crisis adds to the known effects of recent processes of accelerated indebtedness and widespread social and economic deterioration that Argentina went through. Due to the pandemic alone, social and economic life was profoundly affected. Now, we know that in addition to the extremely high and painful cost in human lives, we will pay a high price in economic decline, loss of jobs, and increase in poverty. There is a clear opportunity here, however, for the private sector to contribute to the creation of a system with better preparedness, both in the domestic market and in the export sector. In the case of Argentina, not only the traditional agro-export sector is called upon, which is necessary, of course, to ensure food flows for population, vibrant trade, but also other sectors. For example, the sector for the market of medical supplies, enabling additional circulation flows and nodes, improved preparedness and diversification, and that is a possible way forward. Now, from a government perspective, in a context of uncertainty regarding the possibilities of fulfillment of the 2030 agenda, we have to promote and sustain public policies that are consistent with development objectives and that are focused on rights and equality. As we enter into the decade of action, of course, we have technically entered, but as we go deeper into the decade of action, we will work with foreign policy as a central part of this process. We will therefore advance in the implementation of the 2030 agenda, considering the lessons learned in these 4 years of implementation at all levels, say national and subnational implementation. And nationally, we will face the obstacles and the challenges that we identified in our second VNR, which was presented yesterday at the HLBF, and I won't go into that because of time constraint, but it's available for everyone to see. And in this scenario, it is imperative a review in light of new public policy priorities and national context to establish a framework for monitoring indicators and budgetary investment to work on. Now, these are just some initial reflections. Of course, I might go deeper into that as the discussion evolves. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. And I had a quick look at the government's website, and it's very clear that there's a clear agenda and very much looking at collaboration and working with the private sector. So I think that's a real leadership role that you've taken now. Carolyn, I mean, you're again working across the world with a variety of organizations, but with a real focus on people. And I think, again, one of the things the pandemic has really brought to light is that many companies were not necessarily prepared before this to think about their people and the communities in which they live and work, but that's changed dramatically. Can you share with us what you've observed and what you think the role of business should be?
Yes, thanks so much, Lyndon, and thank you to the WBCSD BCSD for this conversation. A couple of reflections, and I think we heard from the UNDESA Assistant Secretary General at the beginning, Elliot, about the compounding of inequalities. Obviously, we've seen many of those who are already economically and health-wise most vulnerable hit additional negative impacts on their lives, livelihoods and health out of this pandemic. But as he reflected, where you don't have access to water, you don't have access to technology, all of these impacts compound. And I think already before this pandemic, we had this burgeoning conversation around a shift to stakeholder capitalism, to thinking beyond shareholders alone, and we talk about employees, suppliers, customers, communities. I think what the pandemic has done is say, yes, all of that, but more than that, because it's not just generic categories of people, it's the most vulnerable within those categories. And that's what we've really seen come to the fore here, that these vulnerabilities compound. We need to be looking not just at the workforce in general, we need to be understanding where people who are on short-term contracts, who are in precarious forms of work, who work in the gig economy on quote-unquote non-employed status, are most exposed to the economic and the health effects of what's going on. But in combination with that, the realization also that business and all of us in society depend on these same people, right? They're labeled essential workers, key workers in different countries, recognizing not only are they most impacted, but there's a particular dependence on those individuals. And I think what we see through this is that as we look at how we build back better, build forward better, as you say, we need really to be thinking not in general amorphous categories, but who is most vulnerable in connection with my business, in connection with my value chains. And we heard from the gentleman from CP Group about thinking about whose jobs are most exposed, who is most at risk from what's happening. And if we keep that lens, that focus on who's most vulnerable, then I think we can recalibrate how we prioritize what needs to be done. None of which is easy, and of course there are economic constraints, real and tangible ones. This isn't an easy option, but again, connected with that, how business is engaging government around the safety nets that are needed, and that conversation between business and government that needs to be happening, because people are going to have to be laid off, have been laid off, and that will continue to be a reality. And yet, where are the protections in place that also government needs to provide there? And I think my other reflection would just be, you know, that real change is always uncomfortable. It's not just the easy bits that one can pick off. It takes the difficult bits that really take the introspection and the challenging questions. And one of those is around, I think, business models. Filippo referred at the beginning to this just-in-time model as one critical sort of facet of many business models that has proven to be unresilient for businesses and highly damaging for many of the most vulnerable people who work in those businesses and their supply chains. We've certainly been doing a lot of work looking at features of business models that carry inherent risks to people. And where one can't simply say to the social compliance department, please go and sort this out at the operational level, when it's wired into how the business is intended to run. And whether we look at some of the high-speed, low-cost models, just in time, as I said, gig economy models, use of personal data and profiling of people and commoditization of these are all facets of business models that carry inherent risk to people. And I think this is also a time when we need to be looking internally at the top level and saying, are we set up to work in ways that make sure the most vulnerable people are as well protected as possible, or are we not? And if not, to take some steps to address that too at the very core of business.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. And a real reminder, I think, about, you know, an important role that business has to play in society. And I think that is a very active conversation in this one around stakeholder capitalism at this time. And I think we will see changes going forward. Moving ahead, we're now thinking about, you know, of course, we mentioned the climate agenda that was very present and is still very present. And part of that, of course, is the massive shift in the energy transition, and indeed the way that the financial markets are starting to price in carbon going forward. And the challenges about decarbonisation that still sit with business. And as Alan mentioned, you business still has to run today, it has to deal with COVID, and it has to be thinking about tomorrow all at the same time. So I'll start with you, actually, Alan. Again, you're in one of the sectors that is absolutely in the middle of this transition. Can you share a little bit about what you're doing to accelerate, even within the context of COVID?
So ArcelorMittal probably has one of the largest carbon footprints in the world. Our scope 1 is 200 million tons. And that's partly because we make steel and partly because we're such a large company. Ironically, as the world transitions towards low carbon, zero carbon, and totally circular, steel is a very useful product for that transition. So we make it easy for our customers to make the transition. Our challenge is to changing the way we convert iron ore into steel, and we've got to change the way we do that. So our commitment at the moment is to test all the different technologies for making steel without carbon. And the good news is, a bit like energy a few years ago, was that the technology exists. There isn't technical challenges for making the change. The challenge is remaining competitive in the process. Not only do we need to find new funds to actually fund the change in technology, we're introducing a way of making steel which is more expensive than the way we currently make steel. So how do we compete in a market where you can move steel all around the world? And so for us, our challenge is more policy. And so we're very proactive in creating the right policy mechanisms to make sure that the steel we know we can make without carbon will actually be sold in a competitive marketplace. And what we've got in Europe is the need to develop the technology because we've got a price on carbon, but we are competing with people who can import steel made in countries without a price on carbon, the old-fashioned way, and sell it at a lower cost than steel made in Europe. So at the moment, we sort of, in short, we have the technology, but we do not have the policies to make that technology competitive. So we're working on both fronts. And the other area where we're working on is how can we help the market choose steel made the right way? And there we're involved in creating a new organization called Responsible Steel. It's a membership organization. People who make steel, buy steel, supply the raw materials for steel, or civil society can all join this. And together we're setting standards for steel making, not just on carbon, but all ESG issues from labor to biodiversity, but of course carbon is particularly material. And the idea being that we create a standard which then the procurement market will use, and perhaps even the financial markets will use to incentivize and reward those who are making these investments. And so that's gone from no members to 80 members. We've got automotive, we've got construction, we've got all the climate NGOs in it, trade unions are in it, mining companies are in it. We already have a standard for steel making sites. We're developing a standard for mining and raw materials. And we've got a work stream on carbon in particular and green steel and steel made with the new technologies. And I think for me, one of the biggest evolutions I see in a post-COVID world is the quality and depth of collaboration, both from just think tanks to Responsible Steel, which is effectively a multi-stakeholder group with some clear standards, with clear outputs, which are the standards, which can help create market transformation. So in summary, for carbon, we will develop the technology ourselves. We need help to get the right policies to make that technology competitive. And we've created a multi-stakeholder group to actually help develop the standard for that to be a procurement and financial incentive too.
Great, thanks, Alan. And I think that your phrase around the quality and depth of collaboration is absolutely critical to achieving the SDGs at the speed and scale that we need to do that. And that example, again, of industry putting its hand up and saying, we're going to figure out how to make this work through the value chain is critical. Alexandra, again, you work in a very complex food system that has lots of different players. Can you share a bit about how you're dealing with the climate challenge?
Yeah, so Lyndon, I already highlighted earlier on, making agriculture climate resilient, but I now want to highlight a little bit on our, how are we dealing with that as a company and our carbon footprint. And I feel almost dwarfed compared to Alan because our scope 3 carbon footprint is just 7 million tons. But certainly we signed up to science-based targets. We want to stay on the reduction path underneath the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And I do think, you know, there is also an opportunity in that. 50% of our scope 3 carbon footprint comes from agriculture and from our agricultural supply chain. So we've been starting to work some years ago with a couple of thousand farmers to understand how can they reduce the carbon footprint. And we're getting to kind of, with the best practice of technology, we're getting to kind of a 40% reduction. And when we then think the opportunities farmers have to remove carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it actually makes a very nice circular carbon system where agriculture can be positioning itself. You can get carbon dioxide back into the soils by focusing on soil health, conservation agriculture. But when you focus on land efficiency, land productivity, you can use the marginal lands which are not needed anymore for reforestation. And we said, look, we want to innovate for soil health technologies, nitrogen use efficiency, no-till agriculture. And at the same time, we want to upskill farmers to reforest and build back biodiversity. And when I then hear, Alan, that there is a huge kind of compliance and non-compliance market for carbon emerging, which maybe one day can be connected to farming. I mean, this is a huge value capture opportunity for farmers to provide really kind of global social goods back to society. So I'm getting very engaged by that. I think nobody yet has figured it out, how to connect agriculture to carbon trading and the value which is in that. But I think, you know, this is a vision I really want to drive forward, and looking forward for more in-depth partnership like Alan has highlighted.
Again, that's all about the opportunity piece that we're talking about. And I think, again, we're seeing, again, out of the pandemic experience, unlikely collaborations are certainly being part of the picture that we're seeing. So let's move on to think about, and again, both of you referred to policy and the role of government. And again, as we're still navigating the current crisis, but are thinking about the future, I guess, what will the government policies look like that will play a crucial role in determining what the post-COVID world would be like? And as we think about the recovery packages that most governments in the world are starting to talk about, how can they protect the most vulnerable and use public investment coupled with tax reform to advance the Sustainable Development Goals? So over to you again, Martina.
Thank you. Now, in this new scenario of extreme social and economic vulnerability, a framework of solidarity at all levels is essential to, like the 2030 agenda said, leave no one behind in the fight against poverty, inequality, discrimination, and exclusion. And quoting the president of Argentina, starting with the last to reach everyone. Now, in line with the SDGs, a large-scale national plan against hunger was launched by the government early on in its administration. Also, besides measures that will be implemented in the post-pandemic, a series of measures were deployed to face the pandemic while working to resolve in a rational and sustainable way the indebtedness of our country with creditors. Now, undoubtedly, we believe that the international financial system must also be brought in line with the construction of a more equitable world system. Now, going back to the COVID-19 response, Argentina implemented a mandatory preventive social quarantine just 1 week after the first case was diagnosed. And actually, we're still under this quarantine. Now, among the 24 measures implemented to face the pandemic, help with recovery, and protect the population in line with the priorities in the 2030 agenda, the list included measures such as the payment of the emergency family income, which was a bonus that reached vulnerable people in Argentina and that continues to assist families in need, among other monetary bonuses, the exemption from social benefit costs for employers in sectors affected by the pandemic, the provision of credits for MSMEs for payment of salaries and extension of debt maturities, the emergency assistance program for work and production, the support for the production system in area of supplies, equipment, and health technology, and zero rate credits. Now, these measures allowed mitigation of the immediate consequences of the pandemic and the collapse of the health system. They also alleviated the economic and social situation due to the reduction in family income and the decrease in productive activity. But they could not avoid affecting the production value chain that strongly impacted our economy. In the post-pandemic world, we must recover levels of equality, social equity, and growth with the burdens of structural issues and those brought on additionally by the pandemic. Putting Argentina on its feet requires restoring economic, social, and environmental priorities with social integration, justice, and democracy within the framework of federal countries. Also, the mobilization of budgetary resources and access for financing for development are conditioned by the weight of a debt, which makes the expansion of multi-actor and multi-level alliances imperative. I'd like to add that the mobilization of financial resources and alliances requires strengthening South-South and triangular cooperation, promoting the obtaining of resources from the private sector and putting in place mechanisms to attract innovative sources of financing and join efforts to accelerate the process that is needed. Finally, on a related note, I do believe that it's also important to strengthen regional and global integration that is in turn a social, productive, and democratic integration of countries. Now, regional integration is a way to face a global pandemic and its economic and social consequences. In that regard, for Argentina, Mercosur is a key instance. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. And you've really laid out there the breadth of measures and tools, I guess, government has at its disposal in terms of direct intervention, in terms of stimulation, in terms of protecting the most vulnerable. And I think we're going to, again, in the many months to come, see many of those tools. And I guess the focus for business and civil society is to keep that dialogue going with governments to ensure that we are all building back better. Given the time, I'm going to ask the panelists to give us one thought as we wrap up. And I guess that is your message for those who are tuned in today around, I guess the one thing that you think is most important as business thinks about building back better within the context of the 2030 agenda. So Kun Napadol, I might start with you for your view from CP Group.
Yes, thank you very much. COVID-19, as many have said, is just a rehearsal for the real one, climate change. That if we don't work together, well, I'm not just talking about collaboration within the countries, like governments, private sectors, NGOs, academics, and so on. But we have to learn how to work together between the countries as one global citizen. Otherwise, we might be the target to be extinct in 2100, not other species. Thank you, Lyndon.
Yeah, so absolutely. This is unfortunately, I guess the only upside maybe of this is that it gives us an opportunity for a reset and for the world to really think about where we're heading. Thank you. Carolyn, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think I come back to that point around vulnerability. There's a lot of talk about the S in ESG is coming into greater prominence. I think historically there's been really very little coherent understanding of what the S really stands for. It's been a little bit of the miscellany amongst the E, S, and G. And I think if we really understand that it's about people, and first and foremost, it needs to be about those who are most exposed to risk in connection with our economies and how business is done, and how do we rethink in this moment of opportunity how those people are impacted, how we can change the aspects of business models, business practices, relationships with government, taxation systems that underpin whether those people are able to be lifted out of that vulnerability, and understanding that doing so is directly related to our other crisis, the twin to inequality, which is climate change, of course, as others have referred to, right? Many reflect that critical to addressing climate change is education for girls, reproductive rights for women, stewardship of the forests by indigenous peoples. All of these are fundamental to tackling climate change, and they relate to the impacts on people from our economies and from how business is done. Many, many really pragmatic and tangible ways in which we can change this. But we have to look at the core of business and not just out there at social investment and external factors.
Absolutely, we all have a role to play. Alexandra, over to you.
Yeah, I'm also in this rethinking mode, actually. You know, we must find a way not to trade off well-being of people with preserving and conserving nature. We must find now the possibility to overcome that sort of trade-off, which will never benefit nature and or human beings. I think that's really, really important that we take the time to pause now, how we will actually have a really inclusive agenda of people and nature together. We won't have endless funds, so we can't kind of buy ourselves out of that situation, neither governments nor businesses. And this is why I really think we need to go back to the drawing board almost and rethink a long-term sustainable development agenda. What are absolutely critical and important must achievements for people, for humans, and for nature.
Absolutely. Alan, heading to you now.
Yeah, I want to build on what's just been said, and I would frame everything around a bit of humility here, and this emphasis on rethinking. There was a comment earlier on which, you know, pricked up in my ears, that before COVID, the SDGs weren't on track anyway. You know, maybe this is a good moment just to think, why weren't they on track anyway? And what would we have done differently? And what do we now need to do differently with the lessons and reality of COVID? You know, and we could be quite hard on ourselves in that, did we, the sustainability profession, really talk about the risks of pandemics, like we talk about the risks of the other failures in natural and well-being? You know, so where do we as a profession and the owners of the sustainability thinking, what are our deep lessons from this? What do we now need to do differently, given we're happy to admit we weren't on track before COVID, then COVID happened. So what's the learning here? And I think some of that learning will come from this transition from, or balance of, the word sustainability with now the R word, which is resilience. And I hope we just don't drift into saying it's all about resilience and then we push the SDGs as if nothing had changed. You know, there is massive overlap between sustainability and resilience, and a lot of the inputs and the outcomes we need will be the same, but the words are different because they do also have differences in them. So what is the difference between a resilient and sustainable society and a society which is either just resilient or sustainable? That might be over-laboring a bit, but I hope we really do deep dive. What do we mean by resilience? And not just see it's the new brand for sustainability. There are important differences, and I'm not sure if even I can articulate them yet. But I'm seeing everybody use resilience word, but I've not really seen people unpack it and say, this is what resilience is, and this is where it is different to, but builds on sustainability.
Well, that's a question for us all to think about. Thank you, Alan. And now, Martina, over to you for the final word from the panel.
Thank you. Now, from a government perspective, I would just like to quickly reflect on how the implementation of the 2030 agenda, as well as its follow-up and review processes, must be state-led. Implementing the 2030 agenda is such a complex challenge, not least of all because it requires coordination at many different levels. It demands governmental action in each country, international cooperation, coordinated multilateral initiatives, and at both regional and global levels. But we all know states simply cannot do this alone, and success requires all stakeholders to be committed. And in this regard, private sector commitment with sustainable development is decisive, particularly in the time that we are going through now. And for Argentina particularly, the alliance with the private sector is key, and it becomes necessary to develop projects and initiatives between national governments and the productive sector to increase exports in countries, among other reasons. And I firmly believe that connecting to the world in a pragmatic way with productive development policies that include the private sector is what needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think everyone on this call is very committed. So thank you to our panelists today. I appreciate your time and your insights and sharing, I guess, the work that you are doing to bring the change that's required. Alan, just back to your note about resilience, ERM is actually working on a publication at the moment with WBCSD on resilience, which will come out in the coming months or so. And again, we're absolutely trying to unpick that question around the relationship between sustainability, business continuity, resilience, and the way that business is sort of rethinking that at the moment. So look out for that publication. So thank you all to the panelists, and Filippo, handing back to you, and apologies, we're a little bit late, but it was a fascinating conversation. It was hard to draw it to a close.
No apologies needed. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much, Lyndon, for so ably moderating it, and very good insights and food for thought. Also on the sustainability profession, which I think is also the objective here, to take stock along the SDGs agenda and where is the profession heading, what is its role, and also its responsibility to continue to push hard along those lines. So thank you very much to all panelists from across the world for those insights, and of course for your time. We're moving straight away, we're transitioning straight away into the fourth part of the agenda, which is a keynote speech by Masaya Futamiya, Director Chairman of Sompo Japan Insurance, a long-standing ally of WBCSD and one of the 21 member companies headquartered out of Japan, members of the council. Mr. Futamiya has delivered for us a video message, which I'll play shortly, and very important for us. He's the chair of the Japan Business Federation of Keidan Ren, of the Committee on Responsible Business Conduct and SDGs Promotion, a long-standing collaboration between the World Business Council and the Japan Business Federation, Keidan Ren, in order to advance and in order to also get insights from the Japanese business community, which has an enormous drive, motivation, and knowledge, let alone a source of innovation and technology to drive this agenda forward within Japan, but also through its presence, through the presence of its companies all across the world. So if you bear with me, we will be showing a short video of Futamiya-san now, and I will put that up in my best possible tech skills at right now. Let me know if anything doesn't work, and I will adjust.
My WBCSD colleagues taking a journey toward achievement of sustainable society, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address you at Chief Sustainability Officer event. Visiting the United Nations headquarters for the last 3 years to attend the high-level political forum for sustainable development has helped me understand the true value of SDGs. I am pleased that I can participate online this year as well. I have come to believe that the widening gap and division around the world are caused by several factors. One is globalization without social justice and legitimacy. One such example is businesses expanding to some countries in pursuit of low-cost operation and lax regulation, thereby undermining human rights. The other is growth-centric capitalism that only seeks short-term profit. These warning trends became rampant, serving only self-interests. As a result, philosophies of protectionism, nationalism, terrorism, and racism became starker. My belief has been underpinned by a speech made by former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, at the World Economic Forum in 1999. And through conversations with many of my colleagues, including Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. SDGs were adopted, learning from the mistake of having left many people behind, aiming at shifting to a society that is more sustainable and human-centric. SDGs are the collective wisdom of people and the one and only choice for humanity. As they were introduced, we all started initiatives to achieve those goals. However, as Secretary General Guterres has reported, while there are some issues for which the current initiatives are working, some serious reality has also become clear, particularly in the area of climate change, social divide, and other core areas where it might be too late if we do not act now. As the world saw transformative changes to the current global system that is necessary to achieve SDGs, novel coronavirus spread around the world, and now we are facing some fundamental issues and vulnerabilities of societies around the world. I feel that this was a warning that we must revisit our approach on globalization and capitalism. However, if we can turn a threat into an opportunity, we can turn the pandemic into an opportunity to largely correct the course we have taken thus far. I believe this will be the last chance to try and lead our society to be human-centric, which is the ambition of the SDGs. Of course, this is not an easy endeavor. For example, for the year 2020, the emission of greenhouse gas is said to decline by 8% year on year. But unless we maintain this level for the next 10 years, it will not be possible to cap the temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, what then is the key to transform our society to one that is human-centric, sustainable, and inclusive? I believe it is digital transformation, and it is Society 5.0 for SDGs strategy that Keidanren upholds. Keidanren has identified 4 priority measures to this end. They are based on our belief that to build a resilient economic system, even under emergency, we need to swiftly execute a significant transformation of the economic system towards realization of Society 5.0 through digital transformation. I will introduce the first 2. In the first measure, we carry out projects across different industries by pushing for regulation reforms and furthering digitalization and data sharing in medical, education, administration, financial, and industrial fields, while deepening the discussion on the utilization of DX in transformation of industrial structure and organizations. In the second measure, we have announced 305 specific projects that include innovating net zero emission technologies and ensuring implementation, promotion, and financing of those technologies. We call this Challenge Zero initiative, where we strive to create innovative solutions to achieve a decarbonized society. Furthermore, for the biodiversity, which is one of the most important issues along with climate change, we established the Keidanren Biodiversity Declaration Initiative in June this year. We showcased our past initiatives on mainstreaming biodiversity under Aichi targets, along with our strong commitment for the future initiatives. To drive these initiatives by corporations and to build back better to ensure the achievement of SDGs, partnership with investors and innovative financing are necessary in the unprecedented size and methods. Keidanren carried out joint research with Japanese government pension investment fund, the world's largest government pension fund, and Tokyo University on the theme of furthering ESG investment to achieve Society 5.0 and in turn to achieve SDGs. In March this year, we published a joint report on promoting investment for transformation. Achieving Society 5.0 is indeed a trying task, but it is also a great business and investment opportunity. In this joint report, we calculated the growth opportunity of next generation healthcare and energy, smart home and mobility, and fintech to be 250 trillion yen. Keidanren, GPIF, and Tokyo University also proposed to establish a policy environment conducive to achieving this goal and committed to take joint actions. Going forward, we will focus on having constructive dialogues between corporations and investors, also involving other stakeholders, and work on information disclosure and engagement. If I may repeat myself, COVID-19 presented us with one last chance to build a sustainable and inclusive society proposed by SDGs. And without the effort by corporations, SDGs will end up being an illusion. Let us go forward together, determined to make the next 10 years not simply the 10 years of actions, but 10 years of achieving SDGs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to Futamiya-san for these insights, and we very much value his advice, his leadership, and his wisdom all along the way of the path of the SDGs, linking it to Society 5.0, linking it to the partnership with our Japanese members. Appreciate the leadership of Sompo Japan Insurance, of course, in this particular regard, and appreciate the partnership also with the Japan Business Federation, with the Keidanren. So counting and continuing to count on the Japanese business community also as a key solution provider, and with this provocative message around the last chance for transformative change that COVID-19 gives us. Allow me just at the top of the hour, I think we're a minute over, to just wrap up from my side on behalf of the organizers, basically with the key message that we are keeping, and we should be keeping, and we will be keeping the SDGs at the core of the COVID-19 recovery and reset efforts. WBCSD alongside its partners, including many global network partners that are on the line today from across the world, will be keeping the SDGs front and center of all of the efforts, in alignment with the wider vision for the middle of the century, for 2050, as I had outlined before. We believe there are ample opportunities, as also Futamiya-san alluded to, ample opportunities for business positioning, for business resilience, for business innovation, and ultimately for business success within that particular agenda. And of course, working in close partnerships, not only among the business community, but also with all the various actors of the public sector. I want to end on this particular slide in terms of landing it into something also tangible. We talked about the sustainability messaging, the sustainability profession, and certainly also from our side, the idea and the motivation to leave you also with some food for thought and follow-up action for those of you who are interested also, not only in maybe doing it yourself only, but also in disseminating it to colleagues and various stakeholders across your network. We have this online e-learning tool that we have developed called SDG Essentials, and developed in various languages, originally in English, and now thanks to the work of our global network partners, SEATS in Argentina and Centras in Guatemala, available also in Spanish as of this morning, and available also in Japanese. So very much wanting to drive not only discussions, but also follow-up action, follow-up learning, follow-up discussions within the business community, within the four walls of individual companies, of business organizations and other stakeholders across the business, let's say, ecosystem. So please look out for it. It's freely available and hopefully encourages you also in the move towards further action. With that said, I would like to thank again on behalf of UNDESA, on behalf of WBCSD, all of you for your kind attendance. At some point we were about 260, if I counted correctly. Warm thanks, of course, to all of our 9 speakers throughout the day, throughout the afternoon here in Geneva time. Warm thanks to all of you for your patience in bearing through online-only interactions. We will continue along the way of the year, along the year, to continue to build this sort of touch points, to continue to engage, to continue to interact, to learn from each other, and hopefully also motivate each other in continuing to really put the SDGs at the core of all of our efforts. As I mentioned, the key takeaways, the slides and the recording, the key materials will be made available to all of you who registered within the next few days. And we remain, of course, at your service for any question or comment through the website that you see linked here, and very much looking forward to a continued interaction across HLPF over the next couple of days, but also to the continued interaction with all of you across the world. So thanks again to everybody on behalf of UNDESA and WBCSD, and looking forward to being in touch again soon over the screen, and hopefully soon again also in person. Please stay safe and take care of yourself. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.